My family hosted Thanksgiving without me and told me they only had room for real family. I might have believed them for the rest of my life if my grandfather had not shown up at my door that night. Shaking from the cold and holding a birth certificate they never wanted me to see. I learned that I was not the charity case they had raised me to believe I was. I was the daughter of the woman they had erased from every photograph in the house. Then I found the money. $18,500 for my sister, $14,200 for my brother. Nearly all of my grandfather's care fund gone. My name is Maren Whitlock. I follow money for a living, and this time the trail led straight back to my own family. Chapter 1. The ample chair at Thanksgiving. I spent nearly 40 years trying to become someone my family could love, and by Thanksgiving of 2025, I still had not understood that some chairs were never meant to be offered to me. My name is Maren Whitlock. I was 38 years old, living in Omaha, Nebraska, and working as a CPA and forensic accountant. My job was built around numbers people hoped no one would examine too closely. Missing receipts, altered ledgers, trusts that had quietly become personal checking accounts. I knew how to follow money through the places people tried to hide it. But when it came to my own family, I had spent most of my life refusing to look too closely. That Thanksgiving was supposed to be different. I had finally bought my first house, a 2-story place with a narrow front porch, a dining room large enough for 8 people, and windows that caught the afternoon light in a way that made everything feel warmer than it was. I bought it without help from anyone. No family loan, no inherited down payment. Just nearly 20 years of work, cautious saving, and the kind of discipline my relatives like to call excessive until they needed me to fix something. I woke up before 6 that morning. The sky outside was still dark, and the first thin flakes of snow were beginning to collect on the porch railing. I turned on the kitchen lights, tied my apron, and started cooking. I had pressed the linen tablecloth the night before. It was old and soft at the edges, embroidered with tiny leaves that had faded from green to a muted gray. Grandpa Walter had given it to me years ago, saying it belonged with someone who still understood that a table should be prepared with care. I set out the family china, the pieces with the blue trim that only appeared during holidays. I placed 8 folded napkins beside 8 plates. I wrote every name by hand on small cream-colored cards. Margaret Raymond, Dana Bradley, Megan Walter Maren. And 1 extra place, because Margaret always complained if the table looked uneven. I made the pear pie first. Cardamom, clove, butter, ripe pears, and the crust Walter had taught me to roll when I was barely tall enough to reach the counter. Every fall, I made the same pie. I never questioned why the recipe felt older than memory. It lived in my hands, not on paper. By 8, the house smelled like cinnamon and browned butter. By 9, the turkey was brining in the roasting pan. By 10, jazz was playing softly from the speaker near the window, and I was standing at the counter stirring cranberry sauce, while snow drifted against the glass. I told myself this was what normal families did. They made room, they showed up, they noticed the effort. The truth was, I had always been the person standing just outside the photograph. At birthdays and graduations, someone would hand me the camera because I was careful with it. Dana would stand in the center with her arm around Margaret. Bradley would grin from the edge. Raymond would lift his chin toward the lens. I would tell everyone to move closer together, then press the button and step back. Later, when the pictures were posted, people would comment on what a beautiful family we were. I was almost never in the frame. After holidays, I washed dishes while everyone else moved into the living room with coffee and pie. At Christmas, Dana opened jewelry and designer coats while I received practical gifts wrapped in grocery store paper. When I passed the CPA exam, Margaret sent a message with a single word, "Congratulations." When Dana sold her first house as a realtor, the family threw a dinner party with champagne and a cake decorated like a front door. For years, I translated every small cruelty into something easier to survive. They did not mean to hurt me. They were busy. They showed love differently. I should be grateful. At 10:15 that morning, my phone lit up beside the cranberry sauce, Bradley had sent a message. Sorry. Something came up. I stared at the screen for a moment, then set the phone down. Bradley was 39 and had always treated plans like suggestions other people made for his convenience. I told myself one missing chair did not ruin a table. At 10:31, another message appeared. Dana. We changed plans. That was all. No explanation, no apology, no suggestion that we talk later. I called her once. It went to voicemail. I sent a message asking whether Megan was still coming. Dana did not respond. Margaret never called. Raymond never called. I stood in my kitchen with the wooden spoon still in my hand and listened to the jazz pianist move gently through a song that suddenly sounded too cheerful. Then I put the turkey in the oven. I basted it twice. I warmed the rolls. I poured cranberry sauce into the small glass bowl I had bought specifically for that day. Hope can make a person behave strangely. It can keep you setting a table long after the guests have already chosen somewhere else to eat. At 4 that afternoon, the snow was falling harder. The dining room lights were on. The candles were burning. The turkey rested beneath foil. The gravy waited in the ceramic boat beside the stove. My phone buzzed again. For 1 second, I thought it might be Margaret. It was a Facebook notification. Megan Hayes had posted a photograph. She was 16, kind in the careless way teenagers sometimes are, and apparently unaware that anyone had decided the evening required secrecy. The image loaded slowly. Dana stood at the head of her dining table, carving a golden turkey. Bradley was pouring wine into Raymond's glass. Margaret sat beside them with one hand lifted toward the camera, smiling as if nothing in the world had ever disappointed her. Megan leaned into the frame from the side, laughing. Walter was not there, neither was I. I looked closer. The silver serving tray beneath the turkey was the one I had given Margaret for Christmas in 2018. Beside it sat a pear pie. My pear pie. Not literally mine. Dana must have copied the recipe after watching me make it year after year. But I knew the uneven lattice pattern. I knew the sprinkle of raw sugar across the crust. I knew the small glass pie plate, because I had left it at Margaret's house after the previous Thanksgiving. They had taken the food, the traditions, the objects I had chosen with care, and built a family scene without me. I called Margaret. She answered on the 4th ring. I could hear dishes clinking in the background and the low blur of conversation. She said my name with the tired patience people use when they have already decided you are being difficult. I asked why no one had come. There was a pause. Then she said they only had room for family that year. For a moment, I could not speak. I looked at the table in front of me. 8 plates. 8 napkins. 8 candles burning themselves down for people who had never planned to walk through my door. I asked whether Walter was with them. Margaret said he was resting at home, and that I should not make a scene. Then she ended the call. I stood there for another minute with the phone still pressed to my ear. After that, I sat down at the head of my table. I cut a small piece of turkey. I poured myself water. I tried to eat, but the food had already gone cold. The candles burned lower. The snow thickened against the windows. No one called back. At a little after 6, the doorbell rang. I almost ignored it. Then I saw a taxi pulling away from the curb through the front window. A woman stood near the passenger door for a moment, watching the porch. I recognized Helen Brooks from Walter's church. She lifted one hand toward me, then hurried back into the cab. Walter stood on my front step. Snow clung to the shoulders of his coat. His face looked pale and tired. One hand gripped the railing. The other held an old envelope tied with a narrow silver ribbon. I opened the door and reached for him. He looked past me toward the dining room, toward the untouched plates and the candles nearly burned to nothing. His eyes filled with something heavier than sadness. Then he placed the envelope in my hand. I think they took more than my money, he said. Chapter 2. The daughter their's dad. I stepped aside and wrapped one arm around his shoulders as he crossed the threshold. His coat was damp with melted snow, and his hands trembled when I helped him into the chair closest to the kitchen. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The jazz was still playing softly in the dining room. The candles had burned down to short pools of wax. The turkey sat untouched beneath the foil. I used to think the cruelest thing my family had ever done was leave me alone on Thanksgiving. I was wrong. I brought Walter a blanket and set a mug of tea in front of him. He held it with both hands, but the cup still shook against the saucer. I asked whether Helen knew he had come. He nodded and said she had picked him up after he called her from the house. Margaret had told him there was no family dinner that year. Then he noticed the missing place at Dana's table, and he understood enough to know someone had lied. He looked toward my dining room. 8 cards, he said quietly. You made 8 cards. I told him I always planned for everyone. His eyes lowered. That was your mistake, sweetheart. You kept planning for people who never planned for you. The words hurt because they were gentle. He loosened the silver ribbon around the envelope and pushed it toward me. The paper was yellowed at the edges and soft from years of being handled. I recognized his handwriting on the front. My name was written carefully, as if he had practiced it before committing it to ink. I opened the flap. 4 things slid onto the table. The first was a long-form birth certificate issued in Nebraska. The second was a hospital record dated January 1987. The third was a photograph with a crease running through the middle. The fourth was a folded letter. I picked up the birth certificate first, because forms made sense to me. Forms were built to tell the truth without trying to protect anyone's feelings. My eyes found my name, Maren Whitlock. Then I read the line beneath it. Mother Caroline Avery. For a moment, I thought I had misread it. I looked again. Caroline Avery, not Margaret Whitlock, not an unnamed woman who had given me up, not a stranger, Avery. The same last name as Walter. I looked at him and asked who Caroline was. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he seemed older than he had 10 minutes earlier. She was my daughter, he said. My youngest. And she was your mother. The room tilted in a way numbers never did. I had spent 36 years believing I was a child someone had rescued out of charity. That was the story Margaret told whenever she wanted gratitude from me. She said I had come into their lives when I was almost 2. She said Raymond and she had opened their home when no one else would. But the paper in my hand said something else. I had not arrived from nowhere. I had belonged to someone. Walter reached across the table and turned the photograph toward me. A young woman stood outside a white farmhouse, with snow along the porch steps. She had dark hair tied loosely at the back of her neck, and a tired smile that pulled slightly higher on one side. A toddler rested against her hip. Wrapped in a yellow coat, the child was me. I knew it before Walter said anything. The woman's fingers curled around my small hand in the same way. Mine curled around a coffee cup when I was nervous. I asked what happened to her. Walter stared at the photograph. Black ice on Highway 75, he said. February 1989. A truck lost control. Caroline was driving home. You were strapped into the back seat. You did not have a scratch on you. He rubbed one thumb along the rim of the mug. She was 27. I sat very still. The candles in the dining room flickered lower. Walter told me that after the accident, the family had been drowning in grief. He had already lost his wife years earlier. Raymond was Caroline's older brother. He had been married to Margaret for 6 years. Their house was small, their finances were tight, and Margaret had lost her 3rd pregnancy only months before Caroline died. Walter spoke slowly, with long pauses between sentences. He said Margaret agreed to take me in on one condition. No one would tell me who Caroline was. No one would tell me I was an Avery. No one would let me grow up believing I had any claim on the family beyond what Margaret chose to give. I asked why anyone would agree to that. Walter looked ashamed. Raymond wanted peace. I wanted you safe. Margaret wanted control. We all told ourselves we were protecting you. He stopped and pressed his fingers against his forehead. We were protecting ourselves. I thought about every birthday that had passed with a store-bought card signed hours late. Every Christmas morning when Dana received something wrapped in silver paper and I received something practical. Every time Margaret reminded me that I should be grateful. The story had not been an accident. It had been maintained. Walter told me he had tried more than once to speak. When I turned 18, He planned to take me to lunch and tell me everything. Raymond asked him to wait. When I graduated from college, Walter brought the envelope to the ceremony, then left it in the glove compartment because Margaret said the truth would only confuse me. When I passed the CPA exam, he tried again. Margaret always used the same argument. She will be more grateful if she does not know. I looked at the folded letter. My hands had started trembling. Walter reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a small brass key. "There is a box in my car," he said. "Helen brought it inside before she left." I found it beside the front door, an old wooden box with scratches across the lid. The brass key turned with resistance. Inside were photographs, birthday cards, hospital bracelets, and letters tied together with faded thread. Caroline holding me in a hospital bed. Caroline feeding me with a bottle while half asleep. Caroline laughing in a kitchen I recognized as Walter's. A first birthday card with a hand-drawn pear in one corner. A family photograph taken before the accident. Walter stood beside Caroline. Raymond stood on the other side. Margaret was there too, younger and thinner, looking toward the camera with an expression I could not read. I realized I had never seen Caroline's face in any album at Raymond and Margaret's house. Not once, after she died, they had not simply stopped speaking her name. They had removed her from the record. People can erase more than a person. They can erase the evidence that person ever mattered. I unfolded the letter. The handwriting was young and hurried, but steady. "Maren, if anything ever happens to me, please tell my daughter who I was." I stopped reading. My throat closed around the words. Walter covered his face with one hand. "Raymond promised her," he said. "He promised he would tell you when you were old enough. I promised too." He lowered his hand and looked at me. "I failed both of you. For a long time, the only sound in the room was the soft ticking of the kitchen clock." Then Walter looked toward the envelope again. "There is something else," he said. His voice changed. It became smaller. "Since my fall, Margaret has been bringing me papers. Bank forms, insurance forms, things about the house. She says they are routine, but I do not always remember what I signed." He looked at his hands. "I do not think the numbers are right anymore." I asked what he meant. He swallowed. "There is something wrong with my accounts." Chapter 3. Follow the money. The next morning, Walter sat across from Joan Peterson in a quiet office 3 blocks from the Douglas County Courthouse. The snow had stopped before dawn, but the sidewalks were still edged with gray slush, and the sky over downtown Omaha looked heavy enough to fall. Joan was 61, with silver hair cut neatly at her jaw, and reading glasses that rested low on her nose. She had practiced elder law in Nebraska for more than 25 years. She did not react dramatically when Walter explained the papers Margaret had brought him. She did not interrupt. She only listened, took notes, and asked questions precise enough to make the room feel steadier. "When did your daughter-in-law begin managing your finances?" Walter rubbed his thumb along the edge of the chair. "After my fall. She said I needed help." "Do you remember when the fall happened?" "December of 2023. The back steps were icy." Joan nodded. "Did you sign a power of attorney?" "I think so." "Did anyone explain what authority it gave her?" Walter hesitated. "Margaret said it was routine." Joan looked at me. "That word causes a lot of damage." She placed 2 documents in front of Walter. The first gave me limited authority to request and review records connected to his accounts. The second allowed Joan to communicate with his banks and financial institutions on his behalf. Neither document transferred control of his money. Neither allowed me to move a single dollar. Joan explained each page slowly. Walter read every line. When he signed, a notary from the next office witnessed it. I had spent my career telling clients that documentation mattered. That morning, I understood the difference between paperwork used as a weapon and paperwork used as a shield. Numbers had never loved me. But they had never betrayed me either. By noon, I was sitting at my dining room table again. The cold Thanksgiving plates were gone. In their place were account statements, legal pads, colored tabs, and the laptop I used for complex cases. Walter slept on the couch under the same quilt I had wrapped around him the night before. I started with January 2024. DAT account. Recipient, Memo, supporting document. I built the spreadsheet one row at a time. At first, the transactions looked ordinary. Utility bills, property taxes, prescription copays, grocery purchases. A payment to the company that cleared snow from Walter's driveway, then the pattern changed. The first transfer appeared in May 2024, $18,500. Recipient, Dana Hayes, Memo, temporary family loan. There was no promissory note. No repayment schedule. No record that Dana had ever returned $1. I stared at the line until my eyes hurt. Dana had bought a new SUV that summer. She brought it to Walter's birthday dinner and joked that realtors needed reliable cars because clients judged everything. At the time, Margaret had smiled proudly. I added the transaction to the timeline. The second transfer appeared in July, $14,200. Recipient, Bradley Whitlock, Memo, home repair assistance, Agon, no repayment schedule, Agon, no documentation. Bradley had spent most of the previous year complaining about the cost of replacing his roof. He also carried credit card debt, a small business loan, and a personal line of credit that had grown until the total was close to $65,000. I knew because he had asked me for advice once, then ignored everything I said. By mid-afternoon, I found the cash withdrawals, $3,000, $2,800, $4,100, always small enough to avoid immediate attention, always spaced carefully apart. Walter woke while I was highlighting the fifth withdrawal. He shuffled into the kitchen and lowered himself into the chair beside me. Is it bad? I closed the laptop halfway. I'm still reviewing everything. That means yes. I looked at him. It means I want to be certain before I tell you anything. He nodded slowly. I used to know exactly what I had. You still deserve to know. He looked toward the window. I don't want to accuse anyone unfairly. I won't accuse anyone unfairly. I reopened the laptop. I'm going to let the record speak. The following Monday, I returned to work. My office was quiet after the holiday. Most people were still answering emails and pretending not to regret the amount of pie they had eaten. At 10, Eleanor Price arrived for an appointment. Eleanor was 67, recently widowed, and careful with her purse in the way people become careful after trust has cost them something. I had helped her organize tax documents for 3 years. That morning, she placed a folder on my desk and told me her son had taken money from her savings account. He said it was easier if I signed the forms, she said. How much is missing? Almost $30,000. I asked whether she understood what she had signed. She shook her head. He told me families help each other. The sentence landed harder than it should have. Eleanor looked down at her hands. The people who love us should never need our signatures. For a second, I saw Walter sitting at my dining room table with snow melting from his coat. I referred Eleanor to Joan. Then I closed my office door and went back to Walter records. By Wednesday, I found the account that changed everything. It had originally been created in 1988. The opening balance was small, the deposits were irregular. $40, $75, $120. A handwritten note attached to an old statement identified the source. Carolyn's savings for Maren. I stopped breathing for a moment. The deposits continued after Caroline died. Walter had added money over the years. He had invested carefully, never aggressively. By the beginning of 2024, the account held just over $92,000. By October 2025, it was nearly empty. I printed every statement. I laid the pages across my desk. My mother had cleaned other people's houses so I would have a future. My family had used that money to buy a car and pay debts. I found Walter's care account next. That one was almost empty, too. It had been designed to cover home assistance, medical needs, and repairs that would allow him to remain in the house as he aged. Instead, money had been leaving in pieces for nearly 2 years. I called Helen Brooks. She answered on the second ring. Helen, when was the last time Walter attended church? There was a pause. Regularly? Yes. Before his fall. Maybe early 2024. Did he stop going on his own? Helen exhaled. Margaret said the services tired him out. Pastor David offered rides. She said no. Pastor David Miller confirmed the same thing later that afternoon. Walter had attended the same church for more than 40 years. He had donated quietly, paid for repairs without asking for recognition, helped fund winter heating assistance for older members. Then, after Margaret took control of the mail and accounts, his donations stopped. His visits stopped. His friends stopped seeing him. By Friday evening, I had more than bank statements. I had emails. A draft will attach to a message from Margaret's account. A proposed purchase agreement for Walter's house. A revised list of beneficiaries that removed the church and several old friends. The remaining assets flowed toward Dana and Bradley. The house was the part that made my hands go cold. It was not just Walter's house. It was the house where Caroline had grown up, the house in the photographs. The place where my mother had once stood on the porch, holding me in a yellow coat. They were not simply spending Walter's money. They were dismantling his life while he was still alive. I carried the binder to Joan's office the following Monday. She read in silence transfer records. Cash withdrawals, the depleted care account, the Caroline Fund. The draft will the purchase agreement. The discontinued donations, the limited authorization Walter had signed with full awareness. Walter sat beside me, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Joanne turned the final page and removed her glasses. For a moment, she said nothing, then she looked directly at Walter. This isn't family conflict anymore. She rested one hand on the binder. This is elder financial exploitation. Chapter 4. The court moved slowly. Joan did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The binder resting beneath her hand carried more weight than anger ever could. She explained that a power of attorney was not a blank check. It gave Margaret authority to act for Walter's benefit, not her own, and certainly not for Dana's or Bradley's. Every transfer had to serve Walter's interests. Every decision had to respect his wishes. If the person holding that authority used it for personal gain, the law could treat it as a breach of fiduciary duty and potentially something more serious. What happens now? Walter asked. Joanne folded her hands on the desk. We document everything. We report the suspected's exploitation. We ask the court to review the transactions and suspend Margaret's authority while that review is happening. Walter stared at the binder. Will they think Maren is doing this for the money? Joan glanced at me. They may try to say that. I had spent my career watching people rewrite facts when facts became inconvenient. I knew how quickly a family dispute could turn into a story about motives. The daughter who asked questions became greedy. The accountant who found missing money became manipulative. The woman who refused to stay quiet became the problem. I used to think justice arrived when someone finally understood they were wrong. By then, I knew better. Justice usually arrived in thick envelopes and silent rooms, carried by people willing to read every page. Joanne gave me a list of records to organize. Medical notes from Walter's fall, statements from every account, AMOMs connected to the proposed sale, copies of the draft will, timeline of every suspicious transaction. I went back to my office and built the file carefully. $18,500 to Dana. $14,200 to Bradley. Cash withdrawals that added up slowly enough to disappear. Unless someone was looking. Each number carried a memory. Dana's transfer was close to what Caroline had once hoped to save for my education. Bradley's transfer was close to the amount I had spent years paying toward my own student loans, while my family congratulated itself for teaching me independence. Numbers were only numbers until you knew whose hands earned them. 3 days later, Margaret called. I was standing in my kitchen when her name appeared on my phone. Walter was asleep on the couch, one hand resting on the quilt. I answered. Maren, I hear you have been digging through private family records. Her voice was controlled, but the warmth she performed for other people was gone. Walter asked me to review his accounts. He is confused. He understood the authorization he signed. You are taking advantage of an old man. I looked at the binder on the table. No, I am documenting what happened to him. Margaret exhaled sharply. This is family business. No, this is financial abuse. For a second, there was only silence, then her voice hardened. You were never really one of us. The words should have broken something in me. Years earlier, they would have. I would have apologized for asking questions. I would have retreated and spent another decade trying to earn my chair. Instead, I thought about Caroline's handwriting. I thought about the account labeled with my name. I thought about the money taken from Walter while he was still alive to need it. Then, why did you spend my mother's money? Margaret did not answer. The silence lasted long enough for me to hear her breathing. Then the line went dead. The following afternoon, I drove to Raymond Avery's house. He lived in a brick ranch on the west side of Omaha, with trimmed hedges and a wreath still hanging on the front door from Thanksgiving. He looked tired when he opened the door, but not surprised. I knew you would come eventually, he said. I followed him into the kitchen. I did not bring the binder. I brought Caroline's letter. Raymond stared at the folded paper for a long time before touching it. When he finally opened it, his shoulders sagged. She wrote this before the accident, I said. He nodded. I know, you promised her. His eyes filled. Raymond sat down slowly. She called me from the hospital after you were born. She was scared. She thought she was failing you because she did not have much money. He rubbed one hand across his face. She held my hand and said, if anything happens to me, tell her I loved her. I waited. He looked toward the window. After the funeral, everything was chaos. Margaret was grieving. Dad was barely functioning. You needed a home. And then? I kept thinking there would be a better time. There were 36 years. His face folded inward. I thought silence would make things easier. For who? He did not answer. I pushed the letter toward him. Stand with Walter now. Tell the truth. Help stop the sale. For one moment I thought he might agree. Then he shook his head. Please let it go, Maren. The words were quiet. That made them worse. Sometimes the deepest betrayal does not come from the person who commits the wrong. It comes from the person who sees the wrong clearly and chooses comfort anyway. I took Caroline's letter and left. 2 days later, Joan received a letter from Margaret's attorney. They accused me of manipulating Walter. They claimed I had used my professional background to frighten him. They suggested I was trying to position myself as an heir after discovering my biological connection to the Avery family. Joan read the letter twice, then placed it on her desk. They are building a narrative, she said. I expected that. Expecting it and surviving it are different things. What do? We remove the argument. I signed a formal statement asking the court to appoint a neutral third-party fiduciary if intervention became necessary. I also stated that I was not seeking control of Walter's accounts, his house, or any inheritance for myself during the proceedings. Joan watched me sign. You understand what this means? Yes. You could have a legitimate claim later. I do not want his money. I look through the office window at the winter traffic moving past the courthouse. I want him safe. The emergency petition was filed the next morning. The request was not based on hurt feelings. It was based on immediate risk. The house had a potential buyer. A purchase agreement had already been drafted. New withdrawals were still appearing. Walter had been handed more papers to sign. Even after he began questioning the accounts, Joan submitted the binder with the petition. She also filed a report with Adult Protective Services. The following 6 weeks moved slowly. Walter completed a cognitive assessment. The doctor confirmed mild impairment after his fall, but also documented that he had clear periods of understanding and consistently expressed the same concern about his finances. APS interviewed Helen Brooks. Helen explained that Margaret had blocked rides to church and stopped returning calls from Walter's friends. Pastor David Miller provided records showing that Walter's donations had ended abruptly after Margaret took control of his mail and banking. The banks produced statements. The statements produced questions. The questions produced more records. The process was not dramatic. It was methodical. That was what made it powerful. One Thursday afternoon, Joan called while I was at my desk. The judge issued the temporary order. I stood so quickly my chair rolled backward. What did the court approve? Margaret's power of attorney is suspended pending review. The sale of the house is frozen. No one moves another dollar without oversight. I closed my eyes. For the first time in months, Walter's money was still. That evening, he sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea between his hands. The snow outside had started again, soft and slow. He looked down at his fingers. I hate needing help, he said. You are allowed to need help. I am afraid of becoming a burden. I reached across the table and held his hand. For the first time in my life, I was not the child waiting for someone to decide whether I belonged. You never were. Chapter 5. The table that finally had a place for me. 9 days later, Walter asked me to take him home for his birthday. Not my house, his. The Avery house stood on a quiet street in West Omaha, with a wide porch, dark shutters, and the same white siding I had seen in the photographs of Caroline. It was the house where my mother had learned to make pear pie. The house where Walter had raised his children. The house Margaret had nearly sold while he was still alive to watch it disappear. Margaret had planned the party before the court order arrived. By the time she learned that her power of attorney had been suspended, the invitations had already gone out. Canceling would have raised questions. Margaret hated questions, so she did what she had always done. She arranged flowers. She ordered food. She polished the silver. She acted as if nothing had happened. Walter wore a navy sweater and the wool coat Helen had brought from his house. He sat quietly in the passenger seat while I drove through streets lined with dirty snowbanks and bare trees. John Peterson followed us in her own car. She carried a certified copy of the temporary court order, the binder, and the kind of calm that made people lower their voices without understanding why. I had not been invited for most of my life. That would have mattered. I would have stayed home. I would have convinced myself that showing up would create unnecessary tension. I would have protected everyone except myself. That afternoon, I did not go to the party to ask for a chair. I went because Walter asked me to stand beside him. The front door opened before we reached the porch. Dana stood there wearing a cream sweater and a gold necklace. I recognized from one of Margaret's Christmas gifts. Her smile disappeared when she saw me. Then she noticed Joan. Her face changed. Bradley came up behind her with a glass of bourbon in one hand. What is she doing here? Walter lifted his chin. She is with me. The living room was crowded with relatives, church friends, neighbors, and people I had not seen since childhood. A banner hung above the fireplace. 82 years young, the dining table was covered with food. For a moment, I noticed the place settings. There was no card with my name. I felt the old ache rise, then it passed. Margaret crossed the room quickly. Her voice was low. Maren, this is not the time. Joanne stepped forward. Walter requested that Maren accompany him. Margaret looked at Walter. You should be resting. Walter answered without raising his voice. I have rested long enough. The room went quiet in small pieces. Conversations stopped near the fireplace first, then by the dining table, then near the kitchen doorway. Dana folded her arms. Bradley set down his drink. Raymond remained in the corner beside the window, staring at the floor. A man I recognized from Dana's real estate office approached carefully. Thomas Reed had been named in the draft purchase agreement for Walter's house. Margaret turned toward him. Tell them the sale is still moving forward. Thomas looked uncomfortable. It is not. Margaret stared at him. Thomas cleared his throat. The title company received notice of the court order. The transaction is frozen until the court completes its review. Whispers moved through the room. Margaret's face tightened. Joanne opened her folder and placed the certified copy of the order on the dining table. She explained that the Douglas County Court had suspended Margaret's authority under the power of attorney pending further review. The house could not be sold. No funds could be transferred without oversight. Adult Protective Services had opened an investigation. A formal accounting of the transactions was underway. Margaret looked around the room, as if she could find someone willing to rescue her. No one moved. Dana's voice sharpened. This is humiliating. I looked at her. That was the first thing she understood. Not the missing money, not Walter's fear, not Caroline's account the embarrassment. Walter reached for the wooden box I had carried inside. His hands trembled when he lifted the lid, but his voice remained steady. For 36 years, this family told a lie. He removed the photograph of Caroline standing outside the house as with me in her arms. The room became completely still. Walter held up the picture. "This is my daughter Caroline." He looked toward me. "And this is her daughter." Maren. Dana blinked. Bradley stared at Walter. Raymond closed his eyes. Walter continued. "Maren was never a charity case. She was never a stranger. She was Caroline Avery's daughter. She belonged to this family before any of us decided whether to make room for her." My chest tightened. I had imagined this moment in different ways after reading Caroline's letter. In some versions, I felt victorious. In others, angry. Standing there, I only felt tired. Tired for the little girl who had spent years trying to earn something that had already been hers. Megan stepped away from the kitchen doorway. She looked at her mother, then at Margaret, then at me. "Wait." Her voice was soft. "Aunt Maren was family all along?" No one answered her. That silence was heavier than any explanation. Dana covered her mouth with one hand. Her eyes filled with tears. Bradley looked toward the floor. Raymond did not move. Walter placed the photograph on the table beside the court order. He looked at me. "I did not lose my granddaughter." His voice broke. "I abandoned her." Helen crossed the room and rested one hand on his shoulder. Pastor David stood beside her. He told the room that Walter had never stopped loving Caroline. He had kept her memory alive quietly, even when the family found silence more convenient. Helen added that Walter had asked about me for years. Even when he lacked the courage to tell the truth, it did not erase what happened. But truth was no longer trapped inside a box. The following weeks were slower and less dramatic. Real consequences usually are. The court appointed Patricia Green as Walter's neutral fiduciary. Patricia was 57, precise, patient, and completely unimpressed by family arguments. Every expense required documentation. Every account was reviewed. Margaret never regained control of Walter's finances. The civil investigation continued. Dana learned that the money used for her SUV had come from the account Caroline began with housekeeping wages. She sold the vehicle and returned part of the funds under the repayment agreement Patricia negotiated. Bradley sold equipment from his struggling repair business and entered a debt restructuring plan. He blamed me at first. Then he stopped calling. Raymond lost nothing financially. His punishment was quieter. Megan stopped visiting him. Helen stopped speaking to him at church. Walter remained polite but distant. Some losses cannot be measured on a spreadsheet. By Thanksgiving of 2026, the house felt different. Not Walter's house. Mine, the dining table was smaller than the one I had set the year before. There were fewer plates, fewer expectations. Walter sat near the window with a blanket across his knees. Helen brought sweet potatoes. Pastor David brought rolls. Eleanor Price arrived with a small bouquet, and a pie she insisted was not nearly as good as mine. I stood in the kitchen rolling out pear crust with flour across my hands. Walter watched me quietly. For a second, I saw Caroline in the old photograph. Then I saw myself, not a copy, not a replacement, not a kindness someone had agreed to tolerate. Myself, when we sat down, every chair was filled. I looked around the table and understood something I should have learned years earlier. I had spent 38 years trying to earn a seat at someone else's table. It took losing them to realize I had been building my own all along. Walter placed his hand over mine. "You always belonged here. If you have ever felt like a stranger in the place you were told to call family, tell me where you are listening from. And if this story stayed with you, stay with us for the next one. Sometimes the family we need is not the family that kept us waiting. It is the family that finally chooses to make room."